And tonight's presentation is the methods section, which the methods is a recipe. It is process writing, which means step by step. You write like first, next, then, and you just take yourself through your basic data collection and data analysis and what's happening. So for a lot of people, they'll just sit down and sort of like talk to their computer and get that information down. Like, what am I going to do first? Then what am I going to do next? Then what I'm going to do next? And then go in and sort of finesse it a little bit. But basically, your methods section will be written in the future tense for the proposal, and then it will switch to the past tense after. And I know that's frustrating and confusing. The reason is many people, when they have their proposal, they are also submitting to the IRB. You cannot submit to the IRB with things written in the past tense, or the IRB committee will think you've already done things, which is not ethical, right? They have to check and approve. So if you're using the past tense, it's very confusing for them. Like, did you already talk to these participants? Did you already look at that data? That's why we have it in a future tense. Again, I know it's frustrating, but it's part of the process. When you're switching from future to past, you're only changing those verbs. You're not changing the details, okay? You're writing the methods with so much detail that another researcher could replicate your study. They could go step by step through what you're doing and replicate it. You might be using tables and figures and appendices in this section or chapter, and we do have information in the Writing Center on how to do those. And as always, consult with your department and with your chair and with your advisor, because each project is a little bit different. We're going over what the typical components are, but yours might look just a little bit different. So always check with them. In the methods, we restate our research questions or objectives, and this is important. We start the section or chapter just like we start any other, with like the purpose of this project is to, reminding the reader, then going into those research questions or objectives, so that when they're reading the methods, they can see how those questions are being answered or how those objectives are being met. It's showing how it's all lining up. So just a reminder, our objectives or our questions have a parallel form. They're written in the same way, the same type of word to start them. If you're having questions, same thing, right? They're going to be the same way. And again, if you have those research questions at the beginning, and then you have your data, this is the data that's being collected, this is how it's being analyzed, the reader can see, oh, I get how that's going to answer that question, or at least attempt to answer the question. Now, I know I use cookies a lot, but methods, I'm going to use it again, right? Your methods need to make sense. So if you're giving a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, you're not going to include in it, pick up turkey sausage, marinara sauce, right? That makes no sense to a reader. It's going to make sense. The steps in your methods need to line up and they need to make sense. The other reason why I'm showing chocolate chip cookies is because a lot of writers get hung up on the methods. The methods is your plan. It's not exactly what will happen. It's your plan, okay? And it's okay. A lot of writers get hung up on like, but what if this? What if I don't get 12 participants? What if this happens? What if that? It doesn't matter. I have an event I'm doing Saturday night that I'm planning. It's not going to go exactly like my plan. That's okay. If I were to write down my plan, that's my plan. Chocolate chip cookies were a mistake. The very first chocolate chip cookies were made by mistake. They were trying to make chocolate cookies, and they didn't realize that the chunks of chocolate they put in them would not melt evenly throughout and provide them with chocolate cookies. And they ended up with something wonderful, right? Like, oh my God, what a horrible mistake. Same thing can happen. So don't panic about your plan. You're just saying, this is my plan. And as researchers, we all know that. We all know that it's not going to go exactly according to plan. In this section, you're going to explain your design philosophy, what type of study you're doing or what type of project you're doing. You're going to justify it through the literature by bringing in other studies that you've read and reviewed and say, you know, they showed validity or they showed reliability by doing this. I'm doing the same thing. 12 participants for saturation, whatever. This is why I'm doing. And in many departments, you're not only explaining your study design, I'm doing a qualitative, I'm doing quantitative, I'm doing mixed methods, I'm doing whatever. You're also explaining why you're not doing the others. I'm doing qualitative because quantitative would be this, and that's not what I'm doing, right? You're also doing the opposite. Like, this is why I'm doing this, and this is why I'm not doing something else. You will probably provide the context as well. Again, every project's a little bit different, but context is the environment in which the data was collected. Sometimes it's really obvious. If you're going somewhere to do something, you're doing something in a hospital, you're doing something in school, the context is very clear and obvious. For some people, it's not. They're building a website. They're not quite sure what that context might be, but there still is a context. A context could be the platform that's being used and how it's being disseminated. For qualitative studies, usually the role of the researcher is discussed here as well. So just an example, this one, you know, they just very clearly, the thing about the methods section or chapter, it's very clear and direct. It's very, like, the second site was a nonprofit community-based organization. It's just very, this is what's, again, a lot of people just actually talk it out first and then just finesse the language a little bit. But this is just an example of a context. Again, it could be a school, could be a hospital, but it could also be something a little more nuanced, like stakeholders, like financial data. Some departments do like to have budgets included with this. They like to have staffing information included. And they like a discussion of the organizational culture. Again, that sort of depends on your department and who you're working with. There are participants, no matter what type of project you are doing. Again, if you're building a website, the participants are the people who are part of maybe like your needs assessment, or the people who are going to be looking at that website. In some instances, like a study, it's very clear who the participants are. You're going to provide details about your participants, but you only need to provide what would be important to a reader. We're always thinking about our reader. So if your study does not include gender, you don't really need to talk about that when you're talking about your participants. Or if education's not important in your study, you don't need to include that in your discussion. So it's really, what does the reader need to understand about your participants? What were the inclusion and exclusion criteria? Sample size, again, that comes from other studies that you've read. And then use bias-free language. We do have a resource in the Writing Center on bias-free language, both in APA and in AMA. If you're doing any recruitment, you need to be transparent about that. Who's being recruited and how. Often the recruitment materials appear as an appendix at the end. Like if you sent out a recruitment email, that would maybe be the wording. The transcript for that would be an appendix at the end. If you compensate people for participating, you need to be transparent about that as well, because that can have an effect on the results. And again, just this caveat, I keep reminding, when you end up adjusting your methods after you've passed your proposal, do not tweak that sample size. If you said in your methods, you want 12 participants and you ended up with 10, the methods will still say 12. The results will say 10, okay? Because the methods is the plan. And we all know things do not go according to plan. That's okay. We learn so much more, like with chocolate chip cookies. We learn so much more when things do not go according to plan. And this entire project is a learning experience, not just for you, but for people who are going to read it. Include risk and consent. People who have to go through the IRB, you would be attaching your IRB information, explaining that you submitted to the IRB, that you passed the IRB, and that really does help cover some of that risk and consent Beware of vulnerable populations. My recommendation always is, if you're new to research or you're doing research because it's part of a dissertation or a capstone, I would not include vulnerable populations at this point. I would include a non-vulnerable population. And then later on down the line, now that you've got experience, you know how to do it, then you might want to move on. If that's like in your heart to work with that population, work on it when you've got a lot of experience under your belt and you know how to handle that, because that can be really tricky. So every project has data. Every single project has data, because you need to know if things are working, right? Even if you're, again, I keep using a website as an example, but I have a lot of writers come to me and they'll say, my project's building a website, I don't have data. You do, because how do you know what to put in your website? Did you do a needs assessment? Did you do some sort of a survey? That's data. You are collecting data. So you need to explain. And again, think about step-by-step process writing so that a reader could replicate it. What are you doing first? You know, how are you collecting this data? Where is it being kept? How long is it being stored? Who has access to it? How is privacy being protected? So just like in your head, go through those steps. What is happening step by step by step as this data is being collected, and just write it down. There's a little bit of a difference between qualitative and quantitative data. So with qualitative data, you're always thinking about who's doing what. If you're doing a survey, an interview, a needs assessment, who's collecting that, who's handing it out, where did it come from? Like if you wrote those interview questions, include them as an appendix at the end so the reader can see them. If they came from somewhere, you use someone else's questions or something. Where did they come from? How do you know that they're valid? Did you get permission to use them? Where is this data happening? If there's more than one person collecting the data, more than one person doing interviews, how are you being trained so that you make sure you're doing them the same way? Are you using any kind of program with them? So again, just really think about like step by step what's happening with this. How am I getting this data? How's it being recorded? How's it being transcribed? How are the participants being protected? And include appendices as needed. With quantitative, you're going to be talking, quantitative tend to have instruments involved. They tend to have tools and tests that have already been developed. So in that case, you give a little bit of history. Where did this test or tool come from? What other studies has it been used in? If you adapted it, why? And did you have permission to do that? Include permissions and things as an appendix. Think about reliability and validity. And then you have your data, you have to analyze it. You don't just collect data just to collect data. You have to be like getting those cookies ready, getting that dough all pulled together. You have to put them in the oven. You got to do something with them. Same thing with your data. Your qualitative data, typically you're looking for themes, just like you do in the lit review, but explain that. Is there software being used? Are you doing it by hand? Talk about rigor. Bring in other studies you've read for support of how you're doing it and why you're doing it. So the methods, step-by-step process, but also as you're writing that step-by-step, you're bringing in other studies to support your choices, to justify what you're doing. Whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative, that doesn't matter. And then quantitative, again, talk about your programs that were used, who did what, and discuss reliability, validity, generalizability. According to research standards, if you're using a program like SPSS that everybody's familiar with, you don't really have to go into a lot of detail explaining where it came from. You don't have to use like a lot of citations for it, because it's considered like common knowledge at this point. But you might have some sort of a tool that is not so commonly used, and in which case you would have to provide more information about it. So again, think step by step through this with your methods. What are you doing? Who's involved? Where is it taking place? What data is being collected? How is it being collected? How's it being stored? For how long? How's it being analyzed? Then go back and sort of bring in that support from what you've read to show this is justified, what I'm doing makes sense. But step by step. In the Writing Center, we do have a resource for non-traditional project types. Again, we have people that do projects where they're writing a textbook, they're doing a grant, they're making a website, they're doing something that's not what we consider a traditional study. And we do understand that when writers and researchers are doing those types of projects, they can often be confused about, well, who are my participants? What kind of data am I collecting? What's happening? So this resource goes through, like if you're doing a grant, it's this. If you're doing a textbook, it's this, to really help you wrap your head around that information and not be as confused with it. Obviously, you can also meet with Writing Center coaches, and we can help you as well to figure that out. I just want to show you just briefly this slide. You can see the language being used when you're doing process writing, where things are step by step. Your transitions are really useful. The first assessment, the second assessment, the third, right? Use that type of language to help guide the reader through it. First, next, then. Those transitions can really help because, again, a reader should be able to replicate this without you being there. They should be able to read through it just like a recipe and follow it step by step. So those transitions are key. So again, it's a plan. Don't get hung up on the plan about, oh my gosh, what if it doesn't end up this way? Spoiler alert, it's not going to go exactly according to plan, and that is okay. Just write down your plan step by step, what you're doing. When you write your results, you'll have the opportunity to write what really happened. And when you write your discussion, you'll have the opportunity to really critically analyze the difference between the methods and the results and why things happen the way they did. So you'll have your opportunity to voice why things went sideways if they did. So don't worry about that and don't get hung up on that. Next week, we are doing the results section. So even if you aren't at that point yet, you might want to tune in for that just to see what's coming ahead.